Right. Welcome everyone to today's Lunch and Learn webinar. What's the next chapter for your business? The books that have shaped ours, brought to you by ArcherPoint. If you're in a growing business, it's likely that more than once you've faced a hurdle that could stop you from taking your business to the next level. The one issue that, if unresolved, would prevent you from reaching the goals you've set. At ArcherPoint, we know where you're coming from because we've been there too, many times in fact. This is a recurring theme in any growing business. You figure out a way to run more efficiently, to find the culture of your organization and how to propagate it throughout the company, or get everyone moving in the same direction, and then it happens again. Another hurdle that threatens to slow you down. It's the perpetual change that inevitably occurs when you want to continue growing your business. Our presenter today is Greg Kaupp, CEO of ArcherPoint. Greg was introduced to Dynamics NAV as a client in 1997 and has been working in the NAV community ever since, implementing it in companies from small emerging firms to Fortune 1000 enterprises. In 2002, Greg partnered with two other NAV veterans to form ArcherPoint. As CEO, one of Greg's responsibilities, and something he is also passionate about, is finding ways to strengthen the organization of ArcherPoint and its clients, better positioning us to provide more value to our clients and helping our clients bring more value to theirs. In just under an hour today, Greg's going to share our journey with you. We'll be reviewing key takeaways from the books that have shaped our company and enabled us to grow from a 3-person firm founded in 2002 to a 100-person, employee-owned, self-funded professional services organization today. We will offer a Q&A at the end of Greg's presentation, so please go ahead and type your questions in the questions pane of your GoToWebinar as we go along, or use the raise your hand option to ask your question verbally. I will announce the person asking the question and unmute your line at that time. Without any further delay, let's get started. Greg, over to you.
Thank you, Suzanne. I love the opportunity to talk about, what we learn, the books we read. In fact, one of the things that we really value here within our organization is we have a book club where everyone in the company is invited once every 2 weeks to get together and just constantly explore new things that we can learn and challenge ourselves with. So what I want to do is take all of you back to where we started and kind of follow along the journey and the books that have shaped that journey for us. Because I wish I could tell you that I was smart enough to know the answers to the questions we faced as we've grown from where we started back in 2002 to today, but I'll be honest, I'm not. So thank God for Kindle and the fact that we can now carry around libraries worth of information and learning with us at all times. And so let me take you back where we started in 2002, and really, for me, I thought all we needed was some pretty simple principles in place to achieve and create the kind of business that I wanted us to be. It was, if we had great people, great tools, great intentions, and then we gave people the freedom and autonomy to actually do what they believed best in service of our clients, we'd have a great business. And I would tell you that did work, and that was true when we were small. When just the 3 of us started it, you had your arms around everything, and even up to about 15 to 20 employees, you could still pretty much touch and feel every person, every project, every client. You knew exactly what was going on, and it was very flat, very dynamic, very agile and adaptive. The challenge, though, became as we continued to add clients and add people, the size of our projects grew, the complexity, the challenges, the risk. What we discovered is that we didn't have all the answers we needed. In fact, we began to see challenges in some of our projects with some of the very same people that had been with us from the beginning and had consistently delivered great work and great results. So it was easy to control for that variable if it probably wasn't a people problem. It was probably a process and tools challenge. So as we faced a number of projects, kind of all within a very short time frame that seemed to face challenges that we'd never experienced before, we knew we were missing something. So The first book that I would say has been pretty seminal in our journey may surprise you, but it was a book by Mike Cohn called Agile Estimating and Planning. Because what we tried to explore is we wondered what was it about the projects that we delivered most successfully, not just within ArcherPoint, but over our careers, that kind of defined those successful projects. And then what seemed to be common characteristics of projects that face challenges? Well, Agile Estimating and Planning is what helped us discover a much more agile approach to how we dealt with project execution for our projects. Now, one of the things, and again, it's a pretty dry topic, industrial science and planning, but they talk about this concept of defined process control versus empirical process control, or what we refer to in our industry as waterfall versus agile. So the key thing when you think about how projects have typically been delivered in our industry, we've tried to follow a very prescriptive approach, which would be a defined process control, where you go in, you do your requirements analysis, your design, you build the product or project, you test it, and you go live. And it follows a very predictable, easy to understand sequence of steps and events. But as we looked at our projects historically, the projects that you tried to follow this rigid sequence were not the most successful. Because even if you did everything perfectly, you did great requirements elicitation on the front end, your design was spot on, you executed against the design flawlessly, what had often happened, by the time the client got to see that first iteration of what you'd been working so diligently on, somebody had moved their cheese. The business had changed. And so time and time again, the projects that were the most successful were the ones that understood on the front end of any project, you know the least at that moment in time than you will at the very end of a project. And it's an iterative, cyclical process of constant learning, validation, and reincorporation of that learning into the process. So by the time you get to the end, the outcome that gets delivered has been seen all along the way. It's well thought out, it's well vetted, and it's well understood. So to me, when you think about waterfall versus defined process control, the defined process control really only works when you have common control of all of the variables. So let's think about a typical example of a chemical plant. You know at what comes out at the end of that long process, if there's any issues with quality of the product, you know there was an issue somewhere along the way where you need to adjust the process, you need to adjust the inputs, but as long as you have common control of all those variables, a change in the process or the inputs will change the outcome, and you'll end up with something that an expected or intended outcome. But in the world we live in, we at best may only control half of the variables because the projects are always very dynamic and delivered in concert with our clients. So that was where this whole idea of empirical process control became so important, or what is often referred to as Agile. It's how do you, I really like the tracer bullets analogy, how do you fire cheap, inexpensive bullets and tracer bullets so you can see how close you're getting to the target. And then what's even better is the whole tracer bullets analogy works really well when you're trying to hit a moving target. So as the target continues to move, you can continue to adapt and refine the approach so that by the time you get to the end, it is likely that everyone understands the target you're trying to hit, even though it moved all along the way, and what you end up with at the end is actually what you intended to deliver. So there was another book in this same vein around kind of tools and process, and that was Ken Schwaber's Agile Software Development with Scrum. And he was one of the original, or Ken Schwaber was one of the original signatories to the Agile Manifesto. And so the Agile Manifesto really impacted me. It's individuals and interactions over processes and tools. It's working software over comprehensive documentation. It's customer collaboration over contract negotiation. And it's responding to change over following a plan. Now understand, the Agile Manifesto, like they say, it doesn't mean that the items on the right aren't important. It just highlights that the items on the left should be valued more if we're truly going to follow an empirically based approach or an evidence-based approach to constantly looking at, evaluating, refining a plan and what gets delivered all along the way. So from there, I wish I could say that great processes and great tools helped us accomplish everything we wanted to. And in fact, we ended up with some amazing outcomes. We had the first client who agreed to let us, in essence, test out our theory of how we could deliver the types of projects we do in an agile, Scrum-based approach. It was about $1 million project where it was a joint project between us, the client team, and they had also brought in a division of Accenture to be a part of the project. So it was a big project. It was about I think a little under $1 million project, lots of resources, high risk, and somehow they agreed to let us manage the entire project, including their internal team and the outside vendors, using our Agile Scrum-based approach, which was the first time we'd actually had a project of this size and scope to test it on. We ended up bringing in the project half time and half budget, delivering the outcomes that the client was looking for. So we knew there was some amazing potential in shifting from a defined process to an empirical process control on how we executed our projects. Now, that didn't mean things were easy from there, because as you might understand, even today, after having spent years trying to articulate this approach, explain it, sell it, now having amazing evidence of how well this approach works, it still is very counterintuitive for most people. Most people still want to believe, much like building a bridge or launching a rocket to the moon, that in the types of projects we deliver, we can come up with a comprehensive plan which accounts for all possible contingencies on the front end. Then all we have to do, like a blueprint, is go execute against that blueprint, and what comes out at the end is going to be exactly what the client imagined in their mind. Unfortunately, that's just not how it has ever worked. Oftentimes, if there's too long a gap between the time an idea is envisioned and there's something demonstrated of what that vision may actually look like in the real world, you end up with disconnect. So by the time you actually show somebody something, they go, wow, that is not what I was looking for. So, but needless to say, that was transformational for us in terms of how we thought about the way we did what we did. But still, it seemed like we were missing some things, because as we continued to add people, you know, we went, I think in 2007, from about 16 people to over 50 in 2009 and 10. It seemed like we had people challenges in addition to process challenges that we didn't have before. And so again, that's when I go to Amazon and start looking for culture books, leadership books, and we discovered a great book by Dave Logan, John King, and Haley Fisher-Wright called Tribal Leadership. Now, I think what I probably appreciated most about tribal leadership was I didn't have a way of understanding where were we at in terms of culture in the organization. I didn't have a common language to even talk about it. I didn't have a way to evaluate it. And so the research that Dave Logan and John King in particular did with tribal leadership was understanding that you could describe any organization's culture through the language they use. And more importantly, they defined 5 cultural stages that exist in every organization. Now, stage 1 is life sucks. Now, thankfully, we weren't in stage 1. And life sucks is typically characteristic of people that kind of feel disenfranchised. Think about people maybe in the prison system. The next stage is my life sucks. Now, the difference between stage 1 and stage 2 is that at stage 2 people actually understand there are others who probably have a better life than they do. They just don't happen to be a part of that. So there is at least a recognition of there can be something better, but still in stage 2 it's my life sucks. Stage 3 is I'm great, and by extension you're not. And so it was interesting, and it probably should come as no surprise, that most of corporate America falls in stage 3. I think it goes back to our very independent and individualistic roots where, we celebrate individual competition and success. So probably no surprise. Most of corporate America is stage 3. Stage 4 was where they talked about the beginnings of tribal identification, where we're coming together as a group, and that's where we get the we're great, and by extension, they're not. Now, what they truly found interesting was they didn't even conceive that there might be a cultural stage beyond the tribal identification stage of stage 4. But, and I believe it was Genentech, where they interviewed the companies, and one of the questions they would typically ask people is, who do you feel like you compete with? As you might imagine, someone in stage 3 would say, well, I feel like I compete with Bob down the hall or Sally for the next promotion. If you were stage 4, in their case, they might have said, we feel like we compete with big pharma. We're trying to win share. We're trying to beat our competitors in this space. But what they found is when they asked that same question at, and again, I believe it was Genentech, they said, we used to think that maybe we competed with each other or we competed with big pharma. But what we believe now is we are competing with untimely death. Now, we're not competing with all forms of untimely death. We're not going to be able to address war or hunger and famine. But you know what? We are competing against cancer. We truly believe we can cure cancer in our lifetime. So that was this stage 5 of competing with the possible, or life is great. So one of the things, and I wish I could tell you that when we did this assessment for our own organization that we came back as stage 4 and 5, unfortunately, and I hate to be average, we were pretty average. I would say we were fairly representative of every company that the people who worked for us had come from. And we hadn't done a great job of moving the dial to create that stage 4, stage 5 tribe. So it all started, though, with awareness. And then it's how do you begin to, as they say, use the language of tribal leadership to begin to help people move through the various cultural stages. Well, then there's now they don't call it a companion book, but we definitely did, called The 3 Laws of Performance, also written by Dave Logan and Steve Zaffron. Now, again, 3 Laws of Performance focuses a lot on how language impacts performance. So the 3 laws of performance are how people perform correlates to how situations occur to them. And this was a key learning, because I think so often when we would communicate with each other, we believed that there was truly an objective and correct perspective on how any situation had occurred or should have occurred. But one of the things that was so important in this work was talking about all of us have a unique perspective, which I think we know innately, but this book does a great job of helping to challenge our thinking around how truly we all can believe we have a perfect understanding of a situation, and upon further discovery realize that we all are viewing the situation from different past experience, different perspectives, which vastly changes how the situation occurs to us, and then by extension, how we perform in relation to how that situation has occurred to us. Further, the second law of performance is how a situation arises in language. And a lot of it is the mindset or the filter through which things occur to us, and that's where we get into the past tense versus future-based language. The third law is that future-based language transforms how situations occur to people. So this whole idea of tribal leadership in the cultural stages, the importance of language in particular, understanding how situations occur to people, and how we move people through various cultural stages with future-based language was so key but still, it just felt like, although I would almost argue it felt like and we still do, it feels like we've been piece by piece putting in puzzle pieces of our understanding around how we build a company with a thriving and dynamic culture, executing what we do well, serving our clients well, and each of these felt like key pieces to that learning and understanding, but still very incomplete from a cultural standpoint. So, next book on the list was 5 Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lencioni. And I think what I love about Lencioni's books is they're always quick reads. They're kind of in the form of a business fable. But it was through that book and in reading kind of the fable there that so much of the dialogue and conversations sounded similar to things that we saw going on in our own company. And that's where we get to the 5 principles that he lays out, or the 5 dysfunctions of a team, where the first, and the way, if you haven't read the book, they kind of construct it like a pyramid, where at the foundational layer is what they call the first dysfunction is an absence of trust. If you have an absence of trust, you have a fear of conflict, which would be the next layer up in the pyramid. If you have a fear of conflict, then you have a lack of commitment. If you have a lack of commitment, that leads to avoidance of accountability. And if you have an avoidance of accountability, that leads to an inattention to results. So we realized we had some work to do, because where we could, and probably the easiest way, where we could see we had issues that we needed to get resolved, is there wasn't this, what I'd call, healthy and dynamic conflict, constructive conflict. And I know for many people it gets to kind of a core personality trait where they want to avoid conflict, but Lencioni makes a pretty compelling case in this book that if you don't see conflict, then in the pyramid you also see lack of commitment, avoidance of accountability, and attention to results. And if you don't see conflict, healthy conflict, that is probably because there's an absence of trust. So what we did is we began to do some exercises internally. One of the exercises I think I like the most is called the Johari window. And the Johari window, it's just a very simple tool. It's a 4-quadrant system where on the one axis you have what you know about yourself and what you don't know about yourself. On the other axis you have what others know about you and what others don't know about you. So kind of in that first quadrant of what's known by you and known by others, obviously that's the area of the known. Then in the next box you have what I know about myself, but others don't. And the only way for others to get to know me better is I have to trust. I have to be willing to be vulnerable, and I have to reveal things about myself that I may not have otherwise. And now, granted, we weren't asking anyone to reveal any deep, dark secrets, but just to begin to take that step of vulnerability. And then on the other side, there are things that others know about me that I don't know about myself. It's my blind spots. And the only way I can learn more about myself is others have to be willing to be vulnerable and share the things which might be hard for me to hear. And then the idea being, through me revealing more about myself and helping others understand me better, through others helping me, through them sharing with me and helping me understand myself better and my blind spots, you slowly but surely minimize that quadrant or area of your life that is neither known by you nor known by others. And it's kind of this shared discovery. So one example of how this was so impactful for me, and it may seem like a simple example, but as we're going through this exercise, I said, okay, what is it that I do that I don't even know I do? What's a blind spot for me? And our CFO went, oh, you really want to know? Yeah, this is important to me. I want to grow. I want to learn. He goes, okay, well, let me tell you what you do. And it just annoys me like crazy. He goes, you end every sentence with the word right. I said, wow, I can't even remember doing that. But I said, the fact that you're telling me that means I trust that I do it. I'm just so unaware of that. I said, probably more important than just the fact I do it, what do you hear when I do that. Because I'll tell you, I hear we get to the end of a discussion and you go, right? Like, end of discussion, moving on. Well, wow, okay. I said, I can imagine, even if I were to use that word, that would never be my intention. It would be just a confirmation of, hey, are we on the same page? Are we ready to move on? I said, hey, I honor the fact that you were vulnerable, shared that with me, and so unbeknownst to them, throughout the rest of the meeting, I started keeping track of how many times I ended a sentence in the word right. And after 35 times, I was so annoyed with myself I could hardly stand it. So by that time, everyone had pretty much figured out what I was doing, and it became a joke, because not only did it help me understand myself better, it helped everyone understand as well that there was no intention around me doing it to shut down conversation. It was literally something I was doing unconsciously. But if we hadn't been willing to be vulnerable, I never would have learned that. Now, it was amazing through the Johari window exercise that willingness to be vulnerable then removed the fear of conflict. And so we had probably some of our best discussions. Again, I think one of my favorite discussions is somebody on our leadership team. We were doing some reorganization, and we'll talk about that in a bit in another book we read. But we got to a particular seat that we were trying to figure out who should fill that seat. And I'll be honest with you, I felt like I was the best person, at least at that moment in time, to fill that seat. And so we get to that part of the discussion, and this particular leader, she says, you know, I feel like somebody else should fill that seat. And I didn't see that at all. I mean, great person, but I just didn't see how that person was going to fill that seat. So we talked a little bit longer, and we kept kind of stumbling, because when we'd articulate the accountabilities of that seat, everyone agreed that person probably couldn't fill all those accountabilities, but they kept coming back to that person in that particular seat. So I finally just opened up the discussion and said, well, what about me in that seat? And because we'd gone through these exercises where there was no longer a fear of conflict, this particular leader in the organization said, well, Greg, I'll be honest with you. I see you as ineffective. Wow, man, that's okay. We're getting somewhere now. And I knew if I was going to be defensive, that would completely shut down the trust that we built, the willingness to be vulnerable. So I said, you know what, how about I tell you this. When I get up in the morning, I look in the mirror, and I agree with you. Oftentimes I feel ineffective. I don't feel like I'm oftentimes the husband I want to be, the father I want to be, you know, the leader I want to be. So I said, there are many ways in which I see myself as ineffective. I said, my concern is the ways in which you see me ineffective may be different than the ways I see myself. And obviously, I'm very focused on working on the ways in which I see myself as being ineffective. But I need to understand where you see me as being ineffective. And that's when this particular leader said, well, I'll be honest. You do not get involved in the intimate details of the projects going on in every department. So, wow, okay. Guilty. I said, you're absolutely right. So I said, now, it's important for me to ask, in that particular seat, or in the seat we're talking about, is that something I should do? Because I said, I'll be honest, my desire not to get involved in the intimate details of the projects in every department is because I feel that that would be the antithesis of this seat, not the best expression of it. And so I said, for instance, what I hear you saying is I should micromanage many of these projects. Well, no. Oh, okay. Well, what we discovered through the conversation is that we had a difference in how we viewed the seed, and again, this gets back to the 3 laws of performance, how a situation occurs or performance is correlated to how a situation occurs or our understanding of the language of the situation, and her interpretation was completely different than mine. And because we had created a safe space for the conversation, we uncovered a huge difference in interpretation and understanding that, quite frankly, I don't think we would have uncovered otherwise. So we felt like, we made some major tooling changes, process changes with Agile-based execution and Scrum. We've greatly expanded our understanding of culture and how to build a better culture with tribal leadership, 3 laws, and 5 dysfunctions of a team. But it still felt like, okay, there is a gap between the organization we are today and the organization we believe we're capable of becoming. And I don't know that that ever goes away. I mean, obviously, I think we should always be striving to learn, to grow, and improve. But we felt a significant gap, and that led us to the next book, and that is Traction by Gino Wickman. I would say if there's any book that I could recommend to any leader for their business, their department, their team, it's Traction. And the interesting thing about Traction, there's nothing in there that's revolutionary. In fact, really all it does is takes a lot of the great authors, business thinkers like Collins, Lencioni, Gerber, and packages it up with very prescriptive tools for how to go implement many of the principles that are talked about in these other books. So, for instance, like in Jim Collins' Good to Great, we all talk about, are you on the right bus? Are you in the right seat? Well, that's a great metaphor, but how do you use that? And in fact, I think so often in organizations I'd work for, it was kind of the mangled metaphor. It meant whatever people wanted it to mean. Well, one of the things that Traction really helped with there is giving 2 tools. One's called the People Analyzer and the other's called the GWC, for how you map whether somebody should be on or off the bus, and the People Analyzer maps to core values. So, okay, finally we had a clear way of discussing what does it mean to be a part of ArcherPoint, a part of this organization, and it's all about core values. And then when you look at Right Seat, that's another tool in Traction called GWC. Wants it capacity to do it. And so again, finally we had this objective way and common framework and language to discuss really important topics for the business. And so what Traction does is it breaks the business down into 6 key components, being vision, people, process, data, issues, and then what they call traction. It helps you implement tools for each part of the business. Another key tool for us is under the vision component. It's what they call 8 questions shared by all. And your vision, it's how do you get from vision and values to strategic execution. So what are your core values, your core focus, your 10-year targets, your 3-year vivid picture, your marketing strategy, 1-year plan, 90-day goals, and issues. And it's how do you, there's a quote by Ford that I love, and it talks about, Henry Ford, talks about vision without execution is hallucination. And I felt like so often that's what we had. Again, getting back to where we started, we'd have great intentions, we'd have great discussions, we had great people, but at the end of the day, we didn't have the operating system in place to be able to hold people accountable and can kind of continually come back and say, are we aligned, starting with our core values all the way down from our 10-year target to our 1 year, are we able to hold ourselves accountable to who we want to be and where we're going? So Traction provided that. And these are the 8 questions that I just articulated, which comprises the vision portion. And I would say it wasn't until we started just religiously articulating this vision, constantly reviewing it, and making sure our decisions aligned with our core values, and really following Traction very much like a playbook, that we finally saw what we felt we'd been missing, and that was getting from the vision and the values all the way down to execution, and just that relentless attention to alignment and execution. So, but like all things, still felt like they're missing pieces. So one of the things that they talk about in Traction is the whole process component of the business. And if you're familiar with Michael Gerber's E-Myth and E-Myth Revisited, that's really the source that in Traction Gino Wickman relies on for the process component of the Traction model, or what's called the entrepreneurial operating system. Well, for us, Gerber follows very much a franchise model for how you deal with process. And boy, that no matter how hard we tried to adapt that process philosophy, it just didn't resonate with us. You know, the McDonald's example is kind of front and center for what he uses in E-Myth. We tried to adapt that even to Starbucks, which felt closer to, if we were a franchise, the type of franchise we want to be. But the truth is, what makes Starbucks successful is they deliver the same product over and over and over again, and hopefully with absolute consistency. Well, in our world, every time we work with a client, we're delivering a unique product, something imagined and envisioned by a client, and we're there to help them realize their vision, which is very different from just doing some kind of repeatable process like making a cup of coffee. So we knew we had to find some way to address process that we just were not getting there with the Gerber model and Traction. So that's what led us to Disney. So Dennis Snow used to lead the Disney Leadership Institute, and he has a couple books, and we'll talk about both of them. One is Lessons from the Mouse, and in this book, and really just to highlight again, the reason we went to Disney, we actually spent some time at the Disney Leadership Institute, was to look at how does Disney deal with process. I mean, if you think about great examples of process-driven organizations, Disney's one, Nordstrom's is another, Ritz-Carlton. So, but we felt like Disney probably was a close example of what we wanted to try to emulate. And I love Disney's approach to process. It's like they would say it's unrealistic to think that you're going to drive amazing results through amazing people. Because they said the people that work at Disney are the same people that work other places. They said the difference at Disney is not that they have some magical talent pool to draw from that nobody else does. They said it's our goal is to deliver amazing results through ordinary people with amazing process. So we spent quite a bit of time looking at, first the lessons that they had, which kind of overarching when they think about process, it's where they start. I love the idea, their first lesson of never let backstage come on stage. One of his examples, he said, what most people may not think about or realize is when Cinderella goes backstage, she's a chain smoker and cussing like a sailor. Now, if you ever allowed that behavior to come on stage, you may have some children traumatized for the rest of their life. So as they think about process, it all starts with that. Backstage can't ever come on stage. And then really, too, and this again ties back into 3 laws of performance and the importance of language and how a situation occurs to someone, is why the question, what time is the 3 o'clock parade, is not a stupid question. So, because what people are asking, and it's really the difference between the stated question and the intended question. They're not asking what time does the 3 o'clock parade start. That's pretty self-evident. What they're asking is when does the 3 o'clock parade arrive at where I'm standing, which may be 3:15, it might be 3:20. So really trying to uncover what is the intended, not just the stated question. The importance in thinking about process of how little wows add up. It's because if you think about the millions upon millions of dollars Disney spends to build amazing experiences and amazing rides, but in their surveys, the thing people constantly highlight and remember isn't that. It's the cleanliness of the bathrooms. So again, that doesn't happen by mistake. That's all process driven. Other things is have fun with the job, no matter how miserable you feel, or the fake it till you make it. I think this was the first book I'd ever seen which came right out and said, it doesn't matter how you feel. You show up to deliver an amazing experience to a client, and if you got to fake how you feel, fake how you feel, because the most important thing is the experience that the client receives. Importance of not being a customer service robot, and the importance of how process can help ensure that doesn't happen. Paying attention to the details, never saying that's not my job, this idea that everyone has a customer. In fact, we started thinking about the idea as kind of what we call the big C and little c. No matter how we served our end customer, everyone serving someone internally to create a great product or outcome for a client had a little customer along the way, whether it be internal or external. And then, how do you figure out what's ticking your customers off? And I'd say this is still something we are constantly trying to figure out better ways to do it. You know, having gone to Disney, I realize they are religious about surveying people, and you can get some serious survey fatigue at Disney. So we're always conscious of how do we get the feedback we need to make the changes we need without fatiguing our clients in the process. And then the importance of taking responsibility for your own career. But I'd say in terms of how this really tied back into how we think about process was Dennis Snow's other book called Unleashing Excellence. And here, what they do is fascinating. They do what's called process mapping through the lens of the customer, which I had never even thought of doing it this way. Every process box, when they create a process, starts with the customer ... So we did an example internally just around a customer support request. And so we, developed beautiful swim lanes and process flows and decision boxes and decision trees. All the things that happen when a support request gets submitted. However, when you take the approach that Disney does and every box starts with the customer ... you have a completely different view of this beautiful process you constructed, because, as you might imagine with support request, we would start with the customer submits a support request. Then the customer waits while ... The customer waits while ... And once you've completed about 5 or 6 boxes that all started with the customer waits, it became very apparent that in all that waiting, there wasn't enough communication about how hard we were working to get a request resolved. And so no wonder people would think, in the absence of information, that they had been ignored. Their request had been deprioritized. No one was working on it. So it was that type of understanding which began to help us completely rethink our process. And are we perfect? By no means. But at least being aware of where we struggle, the work we need to do, was a great starting point for us. So then we wanted to say, okay, we feel like we've made some great strides: process, tooling, culture, operating system, but boy, I just think we can do more. And so that's where we began really thinking about converting the company to employee-owned. And so one of the things that really kind of transformed our thinking there was, what would ArcherPoint look like if we were able to take roughly 100 people and we were able to activate them and energize them as fellow employee owners, entrepreneurs, and not just, we all talk about in business, how do you create an ownership mentality within the people that work in an organization. We really wanted to challenge ourselves to how do we go and take that a step further and not just try to create an ownership mentality, but create actual owners. So Jack Stack in The Great Game of Business, their company SRC is probably one of the more famous ESOP examples out there. So we really began to look at what they did in terms of becoming an ESOP, how they activated and energized the ESOP to, again, getting everyone thinking in a line for the long term, not just by thinking like an owner, but by being an owner. Now, so we've got traction, we've got some great learnings from Disney, we've got some tools from Great Game of Business and that Jack Stack provided, but still, as we looked to our 10-year plan, which again, thanks to traction, we had a clear idea, or at least, as clear as you can 10 years out, what we wanted to try to become. And it just felt like the typical legacy, rigid, hierarchical structure wasn't going to get us there. All the different ways in which we thought about trying to organize the company to achieve our long-term objectives just seemed to add more overhead, more complexity, and then the biggest challenge is, would any of that help us do a better job of serving our clients? And we weren't convinced that it would. So we began to ask ourselves, is there another way to organize the company? And we knew there were some great examples out there. One of the examples that I've been particularly fond of is the Gore companies, or most of us know, their Gore-Tex division. Now, Gore-Tex, I think, since the 50s or 60s, has run as a completely flat organization, basically title-less, and typically the way they organize is they'll get up to a plan of about 150, and if they go above that, they might literally build another plant next door just to make sure that they maintain that structure of 150 people or less, which can operate in a completely self-directed, flat environment. Now, what they call their approach is called the team-based flat lattice. The challenge we had as we tried to research what the Gore companies have done, there wasn't a lot of writings that we found which told you how to go do what Gore does. And so we really went out trying to look for what options do we have. And there's a book out there called Reinventing Organizations, and in this book they explore all of the different kind of what they call evolutionary organizational structures that try to move us from the current paradigm, which quite frankly is a result of what was General Motors designed to organize factory workers at the beginning of the last century, and say, moving from this factory mentality, how do we move to an organizational structure that is more akin to a living cell, is agile, adaptive, responsive, and really honors the fact that very few of us live in a factory world anymore. We live in a world of knowledge work, and the factory paradigm doesn't do a great job of activating the creative talents of knowledge workers. So we began exploring that, looking at all these different systems, and out of this exploration, again, kind of going back to why traction was so appealing to us, it was appealing because it came kind of like a playbook. Here's how you go implement it. Do this, do that, kind of step by step. That's what we're looking for. And the final book, for us, at least in this webinar and in our current journey, although I guarantee it won't be the last book in our journey, is Holacracy. So coming out of the Reinventing Organizations book, Holacracy was the one system where they had a fairly well-defined process and playbook for how you would go implement it in your organization. And that's what we decided to do. We had formed the ESOP, or the Employee Stock Ownership Plan, last year. We were ready to create the next iteration or evolution of our structure to go activate those employee owners as owners. And the interesting thing about Holacracy is that it's what's called a distributed authority model. So instead of a model, which the typical model is a hierarchical model where it's predict and control, Holacracy, the whole paradigm, is a sense and respond model. And it's also the difference, probably the biggest difference, if you think about in most hierarchical organizations, it's assumed that no one has permission to do anything unless permission is specifically granted. Well, in Holacracy, it's the exact opposite. Permission is assumed to act to serve the purpose of your role and or roles and accountabilities unless there's something that specifically limits your ability to act. So that paradigm shift in and of itself is incredibly energizing and freeing. It's also a little frightening. But it also, Holacracy, shifts the organizational structure from what oftentimes is an implicit structure of how things get done, which looks nothing like what shows up on an org chart, to being very, very explicit around roles, the purpose for those roles, the accountabilities that those roles have. And so it then shifts, instead of authority residing in a person by holding a box or seat in an org chart, now the authority resides in the roles you fill. So for instance, for us to activate Holacracy in April of this year, I had to formally sign a Holacracy Constitution vesting all of my authority as CEO into a constitutional process, which is the Holacracy Constitution. So now I went from holding one job or one job description as CEO to now I hold, I think at last count, probably 7 or 8 roles in the organization, ranging all the way from some of the things that are still accountabilities that I have today that would be similar to what I had as CEO around visionary, funding, things like that, all the way down to here in our office in Minneapolis. I hold the role of office administrator. So if anything needs to happen in our office, they know where to come. So it really allows me to energize a variety of roles which would not have been possible under the old hierarchical system. So hopefully what you see, at least what strikes me with some fair amount of irony, is how we've kind of come full circle. We started out this whole journey trying to understand how in our project execution we became much more agile, much more adaptive, creating that philosophy that promotes experimentation and doing something as long as it was safe enough to try, and taking that whole agile development model or project execution and pulling that through now to even how we structure the organization for it to sense and respond to changes. And I can tell you, in the last quarter since we've implemented Holacracy, we have seen in some parts of the business, and I'm not saying every part of the business the transition has been as easy, but in certain parts of the business we have seen absolutely dramatic change in results where, because they have the ability to act and make decisions, they have accomplished in the span of 90 days what we hadn't been able to accomplish in the span of years for those same practices prior. So it's a huge mind shift. We still are in the process of implementing it, and it'll probably be much like it was for us with Traction, a 3-year journey at a minimum to feel like we've really gained competency. But it's a journey that we're excited to be on. So I'm going to stop there, Suzanne, and open it up for questions. That's the last book in our current journey.
For now.
Yeah. If we've got any questions.
Yeah, just as a reminder, if you've got any questions, type them in the questions pane of your GoToWebinar console, and we'll gather those up. I do have one question for you, Greg. Where do you get your book recommendations? I know you mentioned Amazon earlier, but any other places that you go to that have kind of led you to these books?
I think the biggest thing is it's always in response to some frustration or pain. So it's not so much, hey, I wonder what I could go learn today. It's, oh my goodness, I feel like I have no idea how to address this issue. Surely somebody has solved that. So I wish I was smart enough to be able to know the answers to the questions I have without having to go Google for people smarter than I am, but that's typically the approach. It's in response to some felt need or pain.
All right, thank you. Let's just check my questions here. And I think it looks like we've done a very thorough job today. No more questions at this time. With that, I would like to go ahead and wrap it up, give everybody a few minutes back in their day. We do appreciate your time. We hope you consider it time well spent. To help us to continue to offer value, we'd like to ask you to take a few minutes more just to give us your feedback. And also submit your suggestions for future Lunch and Learn topics that you would like to be covered. Simply send your feedback to info@archerpoint.com. Again, that's info@archerpoint.com. And with that, I wish everyone a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.